After a vicious argument, my wife left me at a freezing upstate train station with no money and no identification. I was bracing myself to walk 62 miles home in the freezing rain. Then a blind man sitting alone on the platform bench turned his head toward me and whispered, "Pretend to be my son. My private driver is arriving in 10 minutes. Your wife is going to severely regret leaving you with the most dangerous man in the city." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth. I am George Weaver, 67 years old, and the red taillights of my own sedan are burned into my memory. The freezing October rain lashed against my face as I stood frozen on the cracked concrete of the deserted train platform. The argument had escalated seemingly out of nowhere on our drive back from a weekend cabin retreat. Diane had been gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white, screaming about my supposed lack of ambition, a sudden and ferocious attack on my character that left me entirely bewildered. Then she pulled over at this desolate, boarded-up commuter stop. She told me she heard a severe rattling in the trunk and demanded I check the spare tire well. Like a trusting fool, I stepped out into the freezing downpour. The moment my hands touched the cold metal of the trunk lid, the engine roared. The tires spun on the wet asphalt, kicking up a spray of freezing mud across my slacks. I lunged forward, but she was already accelerating down the unlit county road. I stood there, the sound of the engine fading into the roar of the storm. I patted my pockets, my hands shaking violently from the sudden drop in temperature. Nothing. My wallet, my phone, my heavy winter coat. Everything was sitting on the passenger seat of the car she just stole from me. I was wearing a thin cotton sweater and dress shoes. The temperature was plunging toward freezing. The station office was boarded shut with thick plywood. There were no payphones. There were no streetlights on the main road. The nearest town was a 62-mile walk through a mountain pass in a sleet storm. I realized with a sudden sickening clarity that the fight was not a spontaneous eruption of marital stress. She had planned this. She had deliberately steered the conversation into a screaming match to justify pulling over. She needed me out of the car. She needed me stranded. The cold began to seep through my clothes, biting into my joints. I began to pace the short length of the concrete platform, rubbing my arms, trying to generate any sliver of body heat. My mind raced through survival options, but the physical reality of my age and the brutal weather offered only one conclusion. I was in severe danger of hypothermia. The rhythmic tapping of a wooden cane against the concrete broke through the sound of the falling rain. I stopped pacing. At the far end of the platform, sitting completely motionless under the only working flickering street lamp, was an older gentleman. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored cashmere overcoat that seemed impervious to the dampness. A pair of dark sunglasses obscured his eyes, despite the pitch-black night. I had been so consumed by my own panic and the blinding rain that I had not even noticed him sitting there. I took a step toward him, desperate to ask if he had a phone or if someone was coming for him. Before I could even open my mouth, he turned his head exactly in my direction. He spoke with a voice that was eerily calm, smooth, and laced with absolute authority. He said he heard the tires squeal, and he heard my panicked footsteps. He deduced my exact situation with terrifying precision. He introduced himself as Vincent Gallagher. He did not offer pity. He did not ask if I was cold or if I needed an ambulance. Instead, he offered a transaction. He told me his private vehicle was exactly 10 minutes away. He would guarantee my safe return to Manhattan, a warm bed, and access to a level of power and resources that would allow me to absolutely crush whoever just left me for dead. But the warmth and the retribution came with a non-negotiable price. For the next 48 hours, I had to cease being George Weaver. I had to become his estranged son, Colin. I stared at him through the sheets of rain. The proposal sounded like the ravings of a madman, but the supreme confidence in his posture and the undeniable reality of my freezing limbs forced me to listen. He explained that a blind man sitting alone at a closed train station at midnight was not an accident. He was testing a theory, waiting to see if his own family had paid the local dispatchers to ignore this route. They had. He knew betrayal intimately. He could smell it on me. The freezing wind howled through the rusted steel beams of the platform awning. I had no other choice. I stepped closer to him and told him I agreed to his terms. He simply nodded, leaned on his cane, and instructed me to prepare myself because the world I was about to enter was far colder than the storm around us. Headlights pierced the darkness, cutting through the heavy rain. A massive jet-black luxury vehicle, armored and sitting low to the ground, pulled smoothly to a stop right beside the platform. The rear door swung open. A large man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a massive umbrella. He guided Vincent into the vehicle with practiced precision, then turned and gestured for me to follow. I collapsed into the heated leather seat, shivering violently. The interior smelled of expensive cedar and aged leather. The driver handed me a thick woolen blanket and a thermos of hot black tea without me having to ask. As the car accelerated seamlessly away from the desolate station, the freezing nightmare outside became completely muted by the soundproof glass. Vincent sat across from me, his hands resting perfectly still on the silver handle of his cane. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He revealed that he was the founder and majority shareholder of one of the most aggressive private equity firms on the eastern seaboard. He controlled billions. But over the last 6 months, a degenerative condition had completely stolen his sight. He had kept it a fiercely guarded secret from his board of directors, operating through trusted proxies. However, blood is always the first to betray you. His 2 nephews, whom he had elevated to senior executive positions, had discovered his blindness. They viewed him as weak, a crippled lion ready to be slaughtered. Tonight, they were convening an emergency meeting at his penthouse with a team of aggressive corporate attorneys. They intended to present falsified medical documents and force him into a binding legal conservatorship, effectively stripping him of his company, his assets, and his freedom. They had spent months buying off board members and isolating him. They thought they had backed him into an inescapable corner. But Vincent had a final, devastating card to play. He had a son named Colin. Colin had walked away from the family empire 2 decades ago, disappearing into Europe after a bitter dispute over business ethics. Vincent's nephews knew Colin despised his father and would never return to defend him. They had built their entire legal strategy on Vincent having no willing immediate family member to challenge their petition. That was the flaw in their trap. Vincent turned his sightless face toward me. He told me that my job was simple. I was going to walk into that penthouse tonight, introduce myself as Colin Gallagher, and legally contest the conservatorship. My mere presence, claiming my rights as his next of kin, would instantly freeze their legal maneuvers and trigger a mandatory 6-month investigation, giving Vincent the exact window of time he needed to financially destroy his nephews. I gripped the warm thermos. I was a retired architectural consultant, not a corporate raider. But the heat returning to my bones brought with it a surge of clear, focused anger. I told Vincent I would play the part, but I needed something in return immediately. I needed to know what my wife was doing. I asked the driver, a silent professional named Paul, if I could use his encrypted mobile phone. He glanced at Vincent in the rearview mirror. Vincent gave a slight nod. Paul handed the device back to me. I punched in the number of my closest neighbor, Jim. We lived in a quiet, affluent suburb where everyone knew each other's schedules. Jim answered on the 3rd ring, sounding breathless and confused. I did not explain the train station or the storm. I simply asked Jim to look out his window and tell me what was happening at my house. Jim hesitated, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He told me that a massive moving truck was backed up entirely to my front porch. He said a crew of men was rapidly emptying the house, carrying out my antique furniture, my art collection, and the safe from my home office. He said Diane was standing on the lawn, directing the men with a clipboard, laughing, and drinking coffee with her adult son from her first marriage. Jim asked me where I was, mentioning that Diane had told the entire neighborhood association just that morning that I had been transferred to an intensive care facility in Florida due to a sudden, catastrophic mental breakdown. The phone felt heavy in my hand. I ended the call without answering him and handed the device back to Paul. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening force. The argument in the car was not a symptom of a failing marriage. It was the execution phase of a carefully orchestrated financial assassination. Diane had not just abandoned me to punish me. She had isolated me geographically and stripped me of my identification so she could legally declare me mentally incompetent or missing. While I was supposed to be freezing to death on a forgotten train platform, she was liquidating a lifetime of my hard work. She was working with her son to strip my home down to the floorboards and funnel my assets into their own accounts before I could ever find my way back to a police station. I looked out the tinted window at the blurring lights of the highway. The shivering finally stopped, replaced by a cold, radiating fury. I had spent 40 years building a life of comfort and respect, and the woman I loved had tried to erase me in a single afternoon for a payday. I turned back to Vincent. The blind billionaire was sitting silently, analyzing my breathing, sensing the absolute shift in my demeanor. I told him my wife was currently stealing my life. I told him I did not just want to survive this night. I wanted to dismantle her entirely. Vincent smiled. It was a terrifying, razor-sharp expression. He told me that we were going to get along perfectly. He instructed Paul to push the engine to its limit. We had a hostile takeover to execute in Manhattan, and then we had a wife to destroy. The elevator doors parted with a soft chime revealing a penthouse that looked more like a modern art museum than a residence. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering skyline of Manhattan, but the beauty of the room was entirely poisoned by the people standing in the center of it. 4 men in expensive suits were gathered around a massive marble dining table. 2 of them carried the unmistakable, arrogant posture of entitled youth. These were the nephews Vincent had warned me about. The other 2 were older, carrying thick leather briefcases and exuding the predatory calmness of high-priced corporate attorneys. They were in the middle of laying out thick stacks of legal documents when Paul guided Vincent into the room. I hung back in the dimly lit foyer, allowing Vincent to enter first. The taller of the 2 nephews let out a loud, patronizing sigh and stepped forward. He spoke to Vincent, not like a beloved uncle or a respected titan of industry, but like a confused child who had wandered out of his bedroom. He said they had been waiting for over an hour, and that the medical proxies were already signed by the board. The nephew stated with absolute coldness that Vincent needed to sit down and surrender his signing authority immediately to avoid a humiliating public trial regarding his mental fitness. The lead attorney chimed in, tapping a gold pen against a towering stack of papers. He explained that a judge was on standby to approve the emergency conservatorship by morning based on Vincent failing to disclose his blindness to the shareholders. They had everything locked down. They had built a perfect, inescapable cage. They were entirely unprepared for me. I stepped out of the shadows of the foyer and walked slowly into the harsh overhead lighting of the dining area. The conversation died instantly. The taller nephew stared at me, his jaw slightly slackening. The younger one took a physical step backward. I did not look like a man who had just spent the last hour freezing to death at a deserted train station. The rage boiling inside my chest had straightened my spine and hardened my features. When I looked at these 2 spoiled heirs trying to steal an old man's legacy, I did not see strangers. I saw my wife Diane. I saw her greedy son emptying my house. I channeled every ounce of that white-hot betrayal and aimed it directly at the men standing across the marble table. Vincent leaned heavily on his silver cane and turned his face toward the attorneys. He introduced me with a voice as smooth as glass. He told them that they were mistaken about him having no immediate family to oversee his affairs. He announced that his son Colin had returned from Europe to assume his rightful place as the primary proxy of the Gallagher estate. The lead attorney recovered his composure first and let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. He pointed the gold pen at me and stated that Colin Gallagher had been estranged for 20 years and had legally forfeited his position in the family trust. He said my sudden appearance was a desperate theater tactic that would not hold up in front of a probate judge. The taller nephew sneered and added that I had no legal standing in this apartment and threatened to have building security remove me by force. That was their fatal mistake. They tried to bully me. I walked directly up to the marble table, my dress shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I did not raise my voice. I dropped it to a low, dangerous register that commanded total silence. I picked up the gold pen resting on top of their fraudulent medical files and snapped it in half, throwing the piece onto the floor. I looked the lead attorney dead in the eye and told him his entire legal strategy hinged on the absence of a willing next of kin. I told him I was standing right here and I was more than willing. I explained in excruciating detail that if he filed that petition in the morning, I would counter-file before noon. I would drag him and his firm into a grueling multi-year litigation process that would freeze every single asset the nephews were trying to steal. I turned my attention to the nephews. The color had begun to drain from their faces. I leaned over the table, invading their personal space. I told them I knew exactly how heavily leveraged their personal portfolios were. I told them I knew they needed the liquidity of Vincent's firm to cover their own catastrophic market losses. I did not just play the part of an estranged son. I played the part of a ruthless heir who had returned to protect his territory from scavengers. I told them that my father and I might have our differences, but we shared the exact same blood. I promised them that if they did not pack up their briefcases and walk out of the front door in the next 30 seconds, I would use my father's infinite capital to buy the debt of every single company they owned and bankrupt them before the end of the fiscal quarter. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. The air felt suffocatingly thick. The lead attorney looked at the nephews, waiting for a command, but the nephews were entirely paralyzed. They had expected an exhausted blind man who would quietly surrender. They had not prepared for an aggressive predator ready to burn their lives to the ground. The younger nephew swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the elevator. The older nephew tried to maintain his glare, but his hands were trembling slightly against the edge of the marble table. He realized I was not bluffing. He realized the perfect trap they had spent months building had just been shattered into a million pieces. I did not give them a chance to regroup. I raised my hand and pointed toward the door. I told them to get out of my father's house. The attorneys were the first to move. They hastily shoved their documents back into their briefcases, the crisp paper crinkling loudly in the quiet room. The nephews exchanged a panicked, humiliating glance before turning on their heels. They did not say another word as they marched toward the elevator, defeated and exposed. The heavy steel doors slid shut behind them, sealing them out of the empire they had tried to steal. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the hum of the elevator descending. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my mind felt clearer than it had in decades. The adrenaline of the confrontation washed away the lingering cold from the train station. I turned to look at Vincent. He was standing exactly where I had left him, but his posture had changed. The tension had left his shoulders. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He tapped his cane once against the floor, signaling Paul to pour us both a drink. Vincent walked toward me, navigating the room perfectly by memory. He told me that in all his years of corporate warfare, he had never heard a more beautiful execution. He said, "I did not just block their legal maneuver, I completely broke their spirit." He handed me a heavy crystal glass of scotch. We clinked our glasses together in the quiet penthouse. The transaction we had agreed upon at the freezing train platform was no longer just a desperate bargain for survival. It was a cemented alliance. I had saved his empire from his treacherous family, and in return, he was going to hand me the weapons I needed to obliterate mine. I took a slow sip of the scotch, letting the burn travel down my throat. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. The sun rose over the Manhattan skyline, casting long, pale shadows across the pristine hardwood floors of Vincent Gallagher's penthouse. I had not slept a single minute. I spent the entire night sitting rigidly in a leather armchair, staring out at the endless grid of city lights, calculating the exact trajectory of my revenge. At precisely 7 in the morning, the private elevator chimed. A woman stepped into the foyer carrying a heavy silver laptop and a reinforced encrypted tablet. Vincent guided himself into the room using his cane and introduced her simply as Evelyn. He did not describe her as a private investigator or a hacker. He called her a corporate extraction specialist. Evelyn did not specialize in rescuing human hostages. She specialized in extracting the absolute truth from the digital shadows people thought they had permanently erased. Vincent poured a cup of black coffee and informed me that Evelyn had full authorization to utilize his entire corporate intelligence network. I sat across from her at the massive marble dining table. I did not waste her time with emotional outbursts. I did not shed a single tear over my shattered marriage. I did not explain how much I had loved Diane, or how deeply her betrayal had hollowed out my chest. Grief is a useless luxury for the safe, and I was currently a hunted man with zero margin for error. I looked Evelyn in the eye and told her to completely ignore my personal history. I instructed her to follow the money. I needed to understand the exact mechanical architecture of my wife's trap. Evelyn did not offer meaningless condolences. She simply opened her laptop and connected to a private encrypted satellite network. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with a terrifying practiced speed. Within 12 minutes, she had seamlessly bypassed the digital firewalls of my local county police department. She turned the glowing screen toward me. Staring back at me from the police database was my own face. It was a photograph taken at a hospital charity gala the previous winter. Above my smiling face, printed in bold, stark letters, was the word "missing." Evelyn began to read the official police report aloud. Diane had walked into the local precinct at 2 in the morning, projecting the image of a completely hysterical and devastated wife. She told the desk sergeant that we had been driving home from our weekend cabin when I suddenly became violently confused and agitated. She claimed I demanded she pull the car over, and before she could stop me, I sprinted blindly into the freezing woods. The county police had immediately launched a massive search and rescue operation in the mountain pass. They were currently deploying thermal imaging drones and search dogs to locate my frozen corpse. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, heavy sickness twist deep in my stomach. The lie was absolutely perfect because it weaponized the natural sympathies of the authorities against me. Evelyn scrolled down to the legal addendum attached to the police file. Diane had provided the authorities with a signed medical evaluation, stating I was suffering from severe and rapid onset dementia. The doctor who signed the sworn paperwork was a man named Alan Pierce. Diane had casually introduced me to Dr. Pierce 6 months ago at a country club dinner party. I remembered the exact conversation with crystal clarity. I had made a self-deprecating joke about misplacing my reading glasses, and Diane had gently suggested I visit her friend Pierce for a routine cognitive exam just to be safe. I had gone to his private luxury clinic simply to humor her. I sat in his office and answered basic memory questions, passing every single test with perfect cognitive marks. But the scanned document on Evelyn's screen told a completely fabricated story. Pierce had entirely falsified my medical records. He had written that I was suffering from aggressive cognitive decline, severe paranoia, and total loss of spatial awareness. Diane had not just been a concerned wife. She had been methodically building an inescapable paper trail for half a year, laying the precise legal foundation to permanently erase my autonomy. Evelyn minimized the police report and brought up my global banking architecture. We held a standard joint checking account for minor household expenses, but the vast bulk of my wealth was stored in an independent investment portfolio I had painstakingly built over 40 years of architectural consulting. I watched the screen in absolute silence as Evelyn pulled up the master transaction history. The numbers were staggering, and they were all currently sitting at 0. Diane had not even waited for the police to declare me officially dead. She had immediately utilized the forged medical proxy to authorize a total and complete liquidation of my life assets. Over $3 million in high-yield index funds had been sold overnight and wired directly to a holding company registered in Delaware. My entire corporate pension had been aggressively drained, incurring massive early withdrawal penalties that she simply did not care about. Evelyn traced the digital routing numbers through a maze of corporate shell entities. The Delaware Shell Company was exclusively registered to Cameron. He was Diane's adult son from her previous marriage. Seeing his name printed on the financial routing documents sent a fresh, violent wave of fury pumping through my veins. A decade ago, Cameron had come to my home office begging for a massive loan to start his own commercial contracting business. The corporate banks had completely rejected his applications. His own biological father had laughed at him and refused to help. I had written him a personal check for $200,000 against the advice of my own financial planners. I gave him the foundation to build his entire adult life. Now he was using that exact business infrastructure to launder the millions they were currently stealing from me. It was a breathtaking level of coordinated domestic treason. They had physical moving trucks emptying my physical house while their digital accounts swallowed the savings of my entire existence. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, feeling the absolute weight of the conspiracy. The picture was completely clear. I told Evelyn we needed to contact the state authorities immediately and present them with this digital evidence. I was ready to walk directly into the local precinct and demand their immediate arrest for grand larceny and fraud. Evelyn slowly shook her head. She looked at me with a cold, professional pity that chilled me to the bone. She carefully explained the lethal legal reality of my current situation. She told me that if I walked into a police station right now, I would not be treated as a victim of financial crimes. I would be treated as a severely confused elderly man suffering from medically diagnosed dementia. Diane held the absolute power of attorney. She held the falsified medical records signed by a licensed and respected physician. The police would not arrest her. They would simply call her to come pick me up. She would arrive at the station with an ambulance and have me legally committed to a private psychiatric facility before sunset. Once I was locked behind those reinforced doors, heavily medicated, and legally stripped of my human rights, I would never see the outside world again. She would finish selling the estate while I rotted away in a locked ward. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Diane had weaponized the legal system and the medical system against me simultaneously. I was legally dead and medically incompetent. I could not fight her with the truth because my truth had been systematically dismantled and legally erased. I looked across the room at Vincent. He had been sitting silently by the window, listening to every single word with deep, intense focus. I told him my wife had built a flawless cage. Vincent smiled slowly. He tapped his silver cane against the hardwood floor, creating a sharp, echoing crack. He said that a cage is only flawless until someone buys the lock. He told me that Diane was playing a local game of domestic theft, but we were going to play a global game of financial ruin. To destroy her, I could not return as George Weaver, the missing, helpless husband. I had to become the very thing she was trying to steal. I had to become pure, weaponized capital. I turned back to Evelyn and told her to find out exactly what Diane planned to do with my empty house, because that was exactly where we were going to set the snare. Evelyn did not close her laptop. The silence in the penthouse was heavy, broken only by the rapid clicking of her keyboard. She told me the liquidation of my index funds was just the opening move. Diane and Cameron were executing a much larger and far more aggressive financial demolition. Evelyn pulled up the county clerk digital registry for my home. The property was a sprawling mid-century modern estate I had purchased and meticulously restored over 2 decades. It was my life work. The screen refreshed, displaying a scanned legal document stamped with a bright red expedited seal. It was a quitclaim deed. My name had been completely removed from the property title. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the forged signature at the bottom of the page. It was a flawless imitation of my handwriting. Evelyn pointed to the notary stamp next to my forged signature. The name on the seal was Marcus Thorne. The name sent a jolt of bitter recognition through my chest. Marcus was not a stranger. He was Cameron Lead Foreman. 10 years ago, when Cameron came crying to me for that $200,000 loan, his contracting business was drowning in lawsuits. He had hired cheap, unlicensed labor and completely botched a commercial warehouse project. Marcus was facing criminal negligence charges. I did not just write Cameron a check to save his fragile ego. I paid for Marcus' legal defense. I kept his crew off the streets. I fed their families while Cameron learned how to properly run a business. Now that exact same foreman was illegally notarizing the theft of my home. My generosity had literally funded the infrastructure of my own ruin. Evelyn continued tracing the paper trail. The deed had not been transferred to an individual. It had been transferred to a newly formed limited liability company called Apex Holdings. Evelyn ran a rapid cross-reference on Apex Holdings. The sole managing director was Cameron, but he was not just holding the house. Evelyn intercepted a massive data packet between Apex Holdings and a private high-risk equity firm based out of the Cayman Islands. Cameron was using my stolen debt-free estate as collateral to secure an immediate $4 million offshore loan. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking. They were not going to wait weeks to sell the house on the open market. They were going to extract all the equity instantly through a predatory loan funnel, the cash into untraceable offshore accounts, and let the shadow bank foreclose on the property. By the time I could theoretically convince a judge I was alive and sane, the house would be auctioned off by a foreign entity, and the money would be gone forever. But Diane was not finished. Evelyn opened a new window, bypassing the security protocols of my architectural firm corporate pension portal. This was my untouchable safety net, a massive fund I had contributed to for 40 years. It was designed to require multiple layers of biometric and dual signature verification to prevent exactly this kind of theft. Evelyn accessed the firm administrative communication logs. She played an audio file. It was a recording of a phone call made at 8 o'clock this morning. Diane's voice filled the quiet penthouse. She sounded completely devastated. Her voice trembled perfectly as she spoke to my firm human resources director. She cried softly into the receiver, explaining that my dementia had taken a sudden violent turn. She described how I had wandered into the freezing rain and disappeared. She then invoked a rarely used catastrophic hardship clause in the pension charter. She submitted the forged medical proxy from Dr. Pierce, claiming she needed immediate penalty-free access to the entire pension fund to pay for an emergency private search and rescue operation and a specialized long-term memory care facility. The human resources director, a woman I had known for 15 years, sounded heartbroken on the recording. She bypassed the standard 30-day waiting period. She authorized the wire transfer. $2 million, the entire sum of my life labor, was currently pending release. Evelyn paused the recording. She looked at the digital clock on her screen. She told me the wire transfer was locked in a mandatory 24-hour federal clearing cycle. The offshore loan secured by my house was scheduled to execute in exactly 36 hours. The conflict had just exponentially escalated. I was no longer just fighting to prove my sanity or get my house back. I was standing on a trapdoor, and the rope was going to snap in less than a day. If that pension wire cleared, and if that offshore loan funded, Diane and Cameron would instantly become multimillionaires, completely untouchable, behind a wall of international banking privacy laws. I would be left with zero assets, millions in fraudulent debt, and a police warrant for a psychiatric hold. They had accelerated their timeline because they knew I was missing. They were trying to cash out before my frozen body was discovered in the upstate woods. Vincent listened to the entire breakdown without moving a muscle. He slowly turned his head toward me. He asked me if I felt the pressure tightening around my throat. He said, "This is the exact moment most men break. They panic, they rush to the authorities, and they walk directly into the enemy final trap." I stood up from the marble table. The anger inside me had burned past hot and settled into something entirely cold and absolute. I did not feel panic. I felt a terrifying singular focus. Diane thought she was playing a brilliant game of chess, but she was entirely unaware that the board was about to be flipped. She was relying on the slow, predictable machinery of local banks and county clerks. She had no idea I was currently standing in the command center of one of the most ruthless financial predators in the country. I looked at Evelyn and told her to stop tracking the money. I told her we were going to intercept it. I needed to block the pension wire and hijack the offshore loan. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, a slight smile touching the corner of her mouth. She told me that interfering with a federal wire transfer and a Cayman Islands collateral loan required a level of financial leverage that bordered on domestic terrorism. I turned to Vincent. I asked him if his private equity firm possessed the capability to aggressively acquire a shadow bank in the Cayman Islands. Vincent let out a low, dark chuckle. He gripped the silver handle of his cane and stood up. He told me that his firm did not just acquire shadow banks, they created them. The escalation was complete. Diane and Cameron had built their entire scheme on the assumption that I was a helpless old man freezing in the dark. It was time to show them what happens when you strand a man in the dark, and he learns how to control the shadows. The hardest part of being erased by the person you love is realizing that your own face is now your greatest liability. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, watching the morning traffic crawl along the Manhattan streets below. Down there, I was just an elderly man. If I walked out of the lobby and approached a patrol car, I would not be rescued. I would be handcuffed for my own safety. The police would look at my rain-stained clothes and my exhausted face, and they would see exactly what Diane told them to see. They would see a confused dementia patient who had wandered out of the freezing woods. I would be placed in the back of an ambulance injected with chemical sedatives and driven directly to a locked psychiatric ward. Diane held the legal proxy. She would be the only person allowed to authorize my medical release, and she would make absolutely sure that day never came. I had to remain a ghost. I had to let the county police drag the frozen rivers and comb the upstate ravines for my body. I could not be George Weaver until the exact moment George Weaver held the power to send them all to federal prison. I turned away from the glass and looked at Vincent. He was sitting at the head of the marble table sipping his black coffee with the absolute calm of a man who orchestrated corporate warfare before breakfast. I told him I needed to completely paralyze their financial maneuvers without leaving a single fingerprint. Vincent nodded slowly. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a heavy black metal keycard. He slid it across the smooth marble surface toward me. He told me that his private equity firm retained a specialized division of aggressive corporate litigators. They did not practice family law or civil defense. They specialized in hostile corporate takeovers, asset freezing, and international financial sabotage. Vincent said the keycard granted me absolute unmitigated access to this legal strike team. For the next 48 hours, his attorneys worked for me. I was to command them as if I were the supreme shareholder. Within 30 minutes, the penthouse dining room was transformed into a war room. 5 senior attorneys arrived carrying secure laptops and encrypted briefcases. The lead litigator was a sharp, unsmiling man named Bennett. He did not ask about my personal life or offer useless sympathies. He looked at the financial data Evelyn had extracted and immediately saw the lethal architecture of Diane and Cameron's scheme. I laid out my primary objectives. First, we had to completely sever her access to my corporate pension. Second, we had to intercept the offshore loan Cameron was securing against my stolen home. I told Bennett that we had less than 24 hours before the wire transfers cleared federal banking protocols. Bennett did not hesitate. He explained that we could not freeze the pension by claiming fraud because that would require me to appear in front of a judge and prove my identity. Instead, We were going to attack the pension fund from a completely different angle. We were going to bury it in corporate litigation. Bennett drafted an emergency commercial injunction on behalf of one of Vincent's anonymous shell companies. The injunction falsely claimed that George Weaver had signed a massive binding commercial surety bond prior to his disappearance. The lawsuit argued that releasing the pension funds to a domestic relative would violate the priority claims of the corporate creditors. It was a completely fabricated lawsuit, but it was filed with such overwhelming legal force and complex corporate jargon that my former architectural firm would be terrified to release the money. The human resources director would immediately freeze the $2 million transfer pending a full legal review, which would take months. Diane's attempt to steal my life savings was instantly blocked by a wall of high-priced corporate lawyers she could never afford to fight. The pension was secured, but the offshore loan Cameron had taken against my house was the real prize. Cameron thought he was an absolute genius for using an unregulated shadow bank in the Cayman Islands to quickly extract $4 million in home equity. He assumed the offshore status made him completely untouchable by local authorities. But unregulated shadow banks were exactly the kind of financial predators Vincent consumed for sport. Bennett and Evelyn worked in perfect synchronization. They bypassed the local courts entirely and went straight to the international banking wire. Vincent authorized his firm to aggressively purchase the specific portfolio of high-risk debt that included Cameron loan. He did not just stop the loan, he bought the bank issuing the loan. We allowed the $4 million to be wired into Cameron's shell company account. We let him taste the victory. We let him look at his bank balance and believe he was a multimillionaire. But the absolute second the funds landed in his account, Bennett activated a lethal hidden clause in the debt portfolio we now owned. As the new supreme creditors, we issued an immediate commercial audit on the collateral securing the loan. The collateral was my house. We submitted incontrovertible proof to our own offshore holding company that the quitclaim deed Cameron used to secure the loan was forged. Because the collateral was fraudulent, the entire $4 million loan went into immediate catastrophic default. Bennett filed an international banking freeze on Cameron's shell company. The $4 million was locked inside an account he could no longer access. But more importantly, because he had defaulted on an international commercial loan, we now held a legitimate, unassailable corporate lien against my physical house. I stood at the head of the table watching the printed confirmation receipts pile up. The trap was perfectly set. Diane and Cameron had spent 6 months plotting to steal my wealth, using forged medical documents and a desperate story about a lost old man. In less than 3 hours, using Vincent Legal Empire, I had completely paralyzed their entire operation. They had no pension money. The loan money they thought they had secured was frozen behind an international corporate wall. And my house was now legally protected by a billion-dollar private equity firm. They thought they had backed a helpless elderly man into a corner. They were about to discover that they had locked themselves inside a cage with a monster. Now all I had to do was arrange a meeting to watch them realize their lives were over. Evelyn did not sleep. She sat bathed in the pale glow of her monitors, tracking every digital heartbeat of my wife and her son. By noon the following day, the automated banking alerts hit Cameron's email inbox. Evelyn projected his screen onto the wall of the penthouse. We watched the cursor hover over the notifications. The Cayman Islands shadow bank informed him that his $4 million loan was suspended pending a title audit. An hour later, Diane received a formal legal email from my architectural firm Human Resources Department. It was a dense corporate document explaining that the $2 million pension release was halted indefinitely due to a pending commercial injunction. They were completely blocked. But they did not suspect that I was the architect of their sudden financial paralysis. In their minds, I was still a confused elderly man wandering the freezing upstate woods. They simply assumed they had triggered an automated corporate security protocol. They assumed it was bad luck and banking bureaucracy. But bad luck breeds panic, and panic breeds catastrophic mistakes. Cameron was heavily over-leveraged. He had likely promised a portion of that offshore loan to his own creditors, anticipating a rapid payout. Without the immediate cash infusion, his entire shadow empire was going to collapse under the weight of his own debts. I told Vincent they only had one move left. They had to liquidate the physical asset immediately. They had to sell my house. I knew Cameron's psychology perfectly. He was too arrogant to wait for the bureaucratic red tape to clear, and too greedy to walk away empty-handed. Less than 2 hours after the banking freeze notifications, Evelyn intercepted a massive data upload from a local luxury real estate broker. Cameron had completely bypassed the traditional public housing market. He listed my sprawling mid-century estate on a private whisper network exclusively for high-net-worth cash buyers. I stared at the photographs of my home cycling across Evelyn's screen. I saw the custom oak library I had designed and built with my own hands, spending countless late nights refining every architectural detail. I saw the expansive stone patio where Diane and I used to host summer dinners, surrounded by the gardens I had meticulously planted. The photographs felt like an obituary of my own life. They had listed the property at a severely discounted price, demanding an all-cash offer with a mandatory 48-hour closing window. They were willing to lose millions in true equity just to get their hands on untraceable liquid cash before the police officially declared me dead and locked the estate in probate court. It was a fire sale of my entire existence. The sheer disrespect of the discounted price tag sent a cold shiver of anger down my spine, but I quickly suppressed it. Emotion is the enemy of execution. I looked at Vincent and told him I wanted to buy my own house. Vincent smiled, leaning back in his leather chair. He did not hesitate. He picked up his desk phone and summoned the head of his real estate acquisitions division. A tall, aggressively sharp man named Logan entered the room within 10 minutes. Logan did not ask questions about my identity or the emotional weight of the property. He simply looked at the listing details and asked Vincent for his purchasing parameters. I did not let Vincent answer. I took control of the room. I told Logan we were going to weaponize their greed against them. I instructed him to draft an offer that was completely impossible for Cameron to refuse. Logan opened his tablet and began typing rapidly. I told him to create an anonymous holding company based out of Singapore. I wanted the buyer to appear as a faceless foreign investment consortium looking to aggressively park offshore capital in American real estate to avoid international tax liabilities. I instructed Logan to layer the corporate ownership through 3 different holding companies to ensure the true buyer remained absolutely invisible. Then I gave him the numbers. We were not going to negotiate. We were going to offer exactly 20% above their heavily discounted asking price. It was an astronomical sum for a blind cash purchase. It was the kind of offer that makes desperate people completely abandon their common sense and ignore every single red flag. I told Logan there would be no property inspections. There would be no financing contingencies. There would be absolutely 0 delays. The offer was pure, uncut financial adrenaline designed to trigger their deepest predatory instincts. But I included one highly specific, non-negotiable condition. The sellers had to agree to an immediate physical closing. They could not use a digital notary or a proxy lawyer. Diane and Cameron had to appear in person tomorrow afternoon at a designated neutral boardroom in Manhattan to physically sign the final transfer documents and receive the wire transfer. I wanted them trapped in a room with a single door. I wanted to look them in the eye when the floor finally collapsed beneath them. Logan finalized the documents and routed the offer through a heavily encrypted network of international brokers, ensuring it arrived on Cameron's desk, looking like a legitimate corporate acquisition. We sent the poisoned bait directly into his inbox. Then we sat back and watched the digital surveillance feed. The wait was agonizingly short. Cameron was a man driven entirely by instant gratification and supreme arrogance. When he saw the offer from the Singaporean consortium, he did not see an anonymous trap. He saw a miraculous escape hatch. He saw millions of dollars in pure, untraceable cash dropping directly into his lap. He did not ask his real estate broker to investigate the buyer. He did not pause to consider why a foreign entity was willing to overpay by 20% for a house they had never physically toured. His greed completely blinded him to the mechanical perfection of the snare. Evelyn intercepted his frantic phone call to Diane. We listened to his voice echoing through the penthouse speakers. He sounded euphoric, practically breathless with excitement. He told his mother they had just won the lottery. He explained that some massive foreign holding company was throwing cash at the property and they needed to lock it down before the buyer changed their mind. Diane sounded cautious at first, asking about my missing persons case and the ongoing police investigation in the upstate woods. She worried that moving too fast might look suspicious to the local detectives, but Cameron steamrolled right over her hesitations. He reminded her that the pension was frozen and the offshore bank was stalling. He told her this cash sale was their only guaranteed payout, and they had to secure the money before any local authorities started looking closely at the medical proxies. He promised her that by tomorrow night they would have millions safely hidden in untraceable accounts, and my ghost would be permanently behind them. I listened to the woman I had married agree to erase me for a final paycheck. Her brief hesitation completely vanished the moment Cameron repeated the exact dollar amount of the offer. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the absolute cold certainty of a hunter watching his prey step willingly into the cage. Evelyn's screen flashed bright green, indicating a secure document transmission. The electronic signature verification pinged across the network. Cameron and Diane had officially accepted the terms of the phantom offer. They agreed to the in-person closing tomorrow at 3 in the afternoon. They thought they had outsmarted the banking system. They thought their brutal betrayal had finally paid off. They were currently celebrating their brilliant victory, assuming they had completely outmaneuvered the universe. They had absolutely no idea that the foreign billionaire purchasing the estate was the husband they had deliberately left to freeze in the rain. They had taken the bait completely blindly, and the steel jaws of the trap were now fully locked in place. The physical trap for my wife and her son was perfectly set for 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. They were going to walk into a Manhattan boardroom, expecting a mountain of cash, and instead, they were going to find the husband they had tried to erase. But as I watched the digital confirmation of their acceptance glow on the screen, I realized we had one glaring vulnerability remaining. The lawyer. The man who had stamped the fraudulent medical proxy and filed the forged property deed. His name was Russell. If Russell reviewed the Singaporean consortium contract and noticed anything even slightly suspicious, he could halt the entire transaction. He could advise Diane to delay the closing. He could throw a legal wrench into the machinery of my revenge before the ink even touched the paper. I told Vincent we could not leave the lawyer to chance. We needed to completely neutralize his ability to defend them. We needed to own him before the sun came up. Evelyn immediately pivoted her attention away from Cameron and directed her entire digital arsenal toward Russell. She accessed the state bar registry and began pulling his professional history. Russell was not a prestigious corporate attorney operating with integrity. He was a bottom feeder who operated out of a flashy leased office in a high-rent district, projecting an image of massive success that was entirely hollow. He specialized in aggressive estate liquidations, questionable probate disputes, and representing clients who preferred to operate in the gray areas of the law. He was exactly the kind of lawyer who would look the other way when a greedy son brought in a forged signature. But Evelyn did not care about his non-existent morals. She cared about his bank accounts. She dug deep into the financial architecture of his law firm, bypassing layers of encrypted accounting software and offshore tax filings. The truth appeared on the screen within minutes. Russell was drowning. His law firm was bleeding cash at an absolutely catastrophic rate. He had recently lost 3 massive class action lawsuits, and the court-mandated payouts had completely drained his operating capital. To keep his firm afloat and maintain his luxurious facade, he had taken out a massive line of credit from a highly aggressive private lending institution. It was a predatory commercial loan with an exorbitant interest rate and a brutal balloon payment structure. The entire principal balance of over $2 million was due in less than 30 days. If Russell defaulted, the lenders would not just bankrupt his firm. They would seize his personal assets, foreclose on his properties, and initiate a public disbarment hearing. He was a desperate man backed into a lethal financial corner. That was exactly why he had agreed to help Diane and Cameron steal my estate. They had promised him a massive percentage of the Cayman Islands loan to pay off his predatory debt. He was risking his entire career and his freedom on the assumption that I would freeze to death before anyone discovered his forgery. I explained the situation to Vincent, laying out the precise numbers Evelyn had uncovered. I told him Russell was holding the entire conspiracy together out of pure financial terror. Vincent leaned forward, resting both hands heavily on the silver handle of his cane. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. He told me that terror is the easiest currency to manipulate. If Russell was motivated by the fear of his creditors, then we simply needed to become his absolute worst nightmare. We needed to become his creditors. Vincent picked up his desk phone. He did not call his lawyers. He called his senior acquisitions director. He instructed him to immediately contact the private lending institution that held the commercial note on Russell Law Firm. Vincent did not want to negotiate terms. He wanted to execute a hostile overnight buyout of the specific debt portfolio containing the loan. The sheer velocity of Vincent's empire was terrifying to witness. He deployed millions of dollars with a single phone call, as if he were ordering a cup of coffee. Within an hour, the executives at the private lending institution were woken up in the middle of the night with an offer they could not possibly refuse. Vincent's firm purchased the entire debt portfolio at a premium, paying entirely in liquid cash. The electronic signatures were executed in the dark hours of the early morning. Federal wire transfers were authorized and cleared through international channels. By the time the sun began to rise over the Manhattan skyline, the transaction was fully complete. Vincent placed the phone back on the receiver. He turned his sightless eyes toward me and nodded slowly. We now owned Russell. He was entirely our property. He owed over $2 million directly to the holding company that Vincent and I currently controlled. But the absolute beauty of the maneuver was that Russell had absolutely no idea his debt had been sold. The transfer was entirely invisible to him on a daily operational level. He would wake up this morning, put on his expensive suit, and drive to his office completely unaware that the ground beneath him had completely vanished. He still believed he was working for Diane. He still believed he was going to walk into the boardroom this afternoon, facilitate the rapid sale of my house, and collect his percentage to save his failing firm. He did not know that his ultimate masters were the blind billionaire and the missing husband waiting for him at the finish line. We held the power to instantly recall his loan and destroy his life with a single signature. We had completely isolated my wife. We had frozen her stolen pension through corporate litigation. We had hijacked her offshore loan using international banking protocols. We had lured her into a fake real estate closing using her own explosive greed. And now we had quietly purchased the leash of her only legal defender. Every single pillar of her master plan had been systematically hollowed out from the inside. She was standing on a trapdoor, assuming it was solid rock. The morning light flooded the penthouse, illuminating the faces of the extraction team that had worked tirelessly through the night. Evelyn closed her laptop. Bennett packed his encrypted briefcases. The preparation phase was officially over. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the waking city below. I thought about the freezing rain at the train station. I thought about the absolute terror I felt when my wife drove away and left me to die. That terror was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a cold, mechanical anticipation. I was ready to go to the meeting. I was ready to watch my wife fall. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the guest bedroom of the penthouse, adjusting the collar of a charcoal gray bespoke suit that Vincent had ordered for me. The reflection staring back at me was completely unrecognizable from the shivering, desperate man who had begged for his life at a freezing train station just 2 days ago. I looked sharp, dangerous, and fully prepared to walk into the boardroom this afternoon to dismantle my wife. But in any war, just when you believe you have secured all the perimeters, the enemy finds a way to breach the walls. The heavy oak door of the guest suite swung open. Evelyn stood in the hallway, her usual stoic expression replaced by a look of genuine alarm. She told me to come to the main living area immediately. She said the private elevator had just been manually overridden from the lobby. Building security had been bypassed. Before I could ask who had compromised the system, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps echoing across the marble floors of the foyer. I walked out into the expansive living room. Vincent was standing perfectly still near the center table, his hands resting on his silver cane, his sightless eyes angled toward the entrance. Standing across from him were his 2 nephews. They did not look defeated like they had the night before. They looked completely triumphant, radiating a toxic, aggressive energy. They had not come alone. Standing behind them was a broad-shouldered man wearing a cheap suit and a smug expression, holding a thick manila envelope. The older nephew stepped forward, his voice dripping with absolute venom. He told his uncle that he really should have picked a better actor to play his long-lost son. The younger nephew laughed a harsh, grating sound and snatched the envelope from the man behind him. He slammed it down onto the marble table and spilled the contents across the smooth stone surface. My blood ran completely cold. Spread out on the table were high-resolution photographs. The first was a still image taken from a security camera at a highway toll booth showing Paul driving the armored luxury vehicle away from the upstate region. The second photograph was a blown-up copy of the exact missing persons flyer the county police were currently distributing across my hometown. It featured my face, my exact height and weight, and a bold red banner warning the public that I was suffering from severe early-onset dementia and was likely disoriented. The older nephew pointed at the flyer and then pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. He announced to the room that my name was George Weaver. He said his private investigator had spent the entire night running facial recognition scans on the toll booth footage against state databases. He knew absolutely everything. He knew about the fight with my wife. He knew about the medical proxy declaring me mentally incompetent. He knew that the county authorities were currently dredging the freezing rivers looking for my body. The investigator stepped forward and added that harboring a legally incompetent missing person and using him to commit corporate fraud was a massive federal crime. He said the police dispatch was exactly 1 phone call away. The trap they had sprung was absolutely lethal. The older nephew paced around the marble table, laying out the exact parameters of our destruction. He told Vincent that if the press found out the legendary blind billionaire had hired a wandering dementia patient off the street to impersonate his heir, the scandal would instantly obliterate the firm. The board of directors would force Vincent out by midnight. The federal regulatory commissions would freeze all of his assets pending a criminal investigation into corporate fraud. Everything Vincent had built over 40 years would be completely reduced to ashes in a matter of hours. Then the younger nephew turned his attention to me. He smiled a cruel, predatory smile. He told me that he had already read the medical evaluation signed by the corrupt doctor. He knew that if the police walked into this penthouse, I would not be allowed to speak to a lawyer. I would not be allowed to explain myself. I would be immediately placed in handcuffs, sedated, and strapped to a gurney. He painted a terrifying picture of exactly what awaited me. He said I would be driven directly back to my wife and locked inside a psychiatric facility for the rest of my natural life. All of the financial traps we had set for Diane and Cameron would instantly fall apart because the Singaporean consortium would simply vanish into thin air. I would lose my home, my pension, and my freedom in a single devastating stroke. The air in the penthouse felt incredibly thin. The walls were rapidly closing in. The older nephew pulled a fresh stack of legal documents from his briefcase and dropped them next to my missing persons poster. It was the exact same conservatorship petition they had tried to force upon Vincent the night before. But this time, they had all the leverage in the world. The older nephew looked at Vincent and issued his final ultimatum. He demanded that Vincent sign the paperwork, immediately surrendering total control of the private equity firm and all its subsidiary assets. He promised that if Vincent signed the papers, they would take their private investigator and walk out of the door, keeping the secret of George Weaver entirely to themselves. But if Vincent refused or hesitated for even a single second, they would call the local authorities and watch the police drag me out of the building in a straitjacket. I looked at Vincent. The blind billionaire stood perfectly motionless. For the first time since I had met him, he looked genuinely cornered. He had risked his entire empire to protect me and give me the weapons I needed to fight my wife. Now my own tragic baggage was about to bring his entire legacy crashing down. I felt a suffocating wave of guilt and pure panic rising in my chest. The lie Diane told had followed me all the way to Manhattan. Her forged medical documents were acting like an invisible anchor, dragging me down into the dark. The younger nephew pulled out his mobile phone and held his thumb over the screen, waiting for Vincent to make his choice. The private investigator crossed his arms, blocking the exit. We were entirely trapped. We had spent the entire morning building a flawless snare for my wife, and now we were caught completely exposed in a trap of our own. The clock was ticking toward the 3:00 meeting with Diane, and instead of preparing to destroy her, I was standing in a penthouse about to be handed over to the authorities. The sheer weight of the threat paralyzed every muscle in my body. The older nephew leaned over the table, tapping a gold pen against the signature line of the conservatorship documents. He told Vincent to stop pretending he had another move left to play. He sneered and said the game was officially over. If Vincent chose his pride over his safety, the entire city would watch him get escorted out of his own building by federal agents. The entire financial sector would read the headlines about how a blind, pathetic old man lost his mind and tried to use a missing dementia patient to steal from his own family. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city traffic far below. The escalation was absolute. They had found the one vulnerability we could not protect, and they were pressing the blade directly against our throats. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the sound of police sirens. I had survived the freezing rain, only to be buried alive by the exact same lie my wife had started. I waited for Vincent to reach for the gold pen and surrender. The older nephew held the gold pen out toward Vincent, his face flushed with the arrogant certainty of a man who believed he had just won the war. The private investigator stood blocking the heavy oak doors of the penthouse, waiting for the final surrender. I looked at the missing persons flyer lying on the marble table. The face staring back at me was George Weaver, the discarded husband, the victim, the confused old man wandering in the freezing rain. But the man standing in this bespoke suit, breathing the conditioned air of a billionaire fortress, was someone entirely different. I realized in that exact fraction of a second that panic was a reflex of the weak. Panic was exactly what Diane relied upon when she abandoned me. I refused to be a victim of my own identity. I stepped forward and smoothly pulled the gold pen directly out of the older nephew's hand. He blinked in surprise, stepping back as I casually tossed the pen onto the floor. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I looked directly into his eyes and told him he was absolutely right. I told him my name was George Weaver, and I was currently the subject of a massive county manhunt. I admitted that my wife had forged medical documents to declare me incompetent and steal my entire estate. I watched the triumphant smiles on the nephews' faces widen, assuming my confession was a white flag. I told them their private investigator had done an excellent job uncovering the local tragedy of my life, but he had completely failed to understand the global financial demolition I was currently orchestrating in this very room. I turned to Evelyn, who had been sitting frozen at her workstation. I instructed her to project the financial architecture of our trap onto the main viewing screen. The massive wall monitor flared to life, bathing the room in a sharp blue glow. I walked the nephews through the exact mechanical perfection of the snare. I showed them the offshore shadow bank in the Cayman Islands that we had aggressively acquired in the middle of the night. I showed them the frozen $4 million loan. I showed them the corporate injunction blocking the $2 million pension release. And finally, I showed them the Singaporean consortium offer that my wife had blindly accepted just hours ago. The smug expressions melted off the nephews' faces, completely replaced by absolute shock. They stared at the screen, watching millions of dollars being manipulated and frozen with surgical precision. They were corporate executives who prided themselves on ruthless business tactics, but they were looking at a level of financial violence they had never comprehended. I told them that the blind old man they were trying to blackmail had not just taken in a stray off the street. He had partnered with a man who was currently dismantling a multi-million-dollar fraud syndicate for sport. I walked slowly around the marble table, closing the distance between myself and the private investigator. I told him he was a very small fish swimming in a remarkably dangerous ocean. If he made that phone call to the police, he would not just be exposing me. He would be interfering with an active international corporate acquisition. I promised him that Vincent's legal team would bury him in so many federal obstruction lawsuits his grandchildren would be born in debt. The investigator swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the elevator. Then I turned my attention back to the nephews. I laid out their absolute reality. I told them that if they blew the whistle right now, they might temporarily ruin Vincent, but they would also destroy the very equity firm they were trying to steal. The federal regulators would freeze everything, and their heavily leveraged personal portfolios would collapse before Friday. They would win the argument, but they would lose their mansions, their cars, and their freedom. It was a suicide mission driven by childish ego. But I offered them an alternative. I told them they possessed something I desperately needed for the 3:00 closing. I needed physical proxies to represent the Singaporean investment consortium in the boardroom with my wife. I told them their expensive suits and their arrogant, entitled attitudes made them the absolute perfect candidates to play the role of ruthless foreign buyers. If they agreed to sit at that table and help me close the jaws of the trap on Diane, I would guarantee their survival. I looked at Vincent. He nodded slowly, leaning on his cane. He spoke with absolute authority, offering them a minor non-voting seat on the board of directors. He told them they would not control the company, but they would remain incredibly wealthy and completely protected. The choice was beautifully simple. They could choose mutual destruction, or they could choose survival and a seat at the table. The younger nephew looked at the massive digital display showing the frozen offshore accounts. He saw the sheer magnitude of the power Vincent and I wielded together. He realized that standing against us was an absolute death sentence. He slowly reached out and gathered the high-resolution surveillance photographs and the missing persons flyer from the marble table. He handed the entire stack of blackmail material directly to me. He did not say a word, but the submission was complete. The older nephew stared at me, his jaw clenched in quiet humiliation. He looked at his uncle, who remained perfectly still, a monument of untouchable power. The older nephew finally nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He told the private investigator to leave the penthouse and forget everything he had seen. The investigator did not need to be told twice. He practically ran toward the private elevator, eager to escape the room. I stood holding the blackmail documents in my hand, feeling the absolute shift in the power dynamic. The greatest threat to our operation had just been converted into our greatest asset. I had taken the exact weapon they brought to destroy me and handed it back to them as a tool for their own salvation. The nephews were no longer rebellious heirs trying to steal an empire. They were now my employees. They were going to walk into that boardroom this afternoon and help me execute my wife. The final piece of the board was perfectly set. The clock was moving relentlessly toward 3:00. I instructed the nephews to sit down and study the Singaporean contract. There was absolutely no room for error. We had a closing to attend. The glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor of the luxury Manhattan high-rise was bathed in the harsh, bright light of mid-afternoon. I was not standing inside it. I was sitting in the adjacent private observation suite, completely shrouded in darkness. Evelyn had tapped into the building security infrastructure, linking the hidden cameras and microphones of the boardroom directly to our encrypted monitors. I sat beside Vincent, watching the high-resolution feed. At exactly 2:45, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung open. My wife walked into the room. Diane was wearing a tailored black designer dress, projecting the exact image of a wealthy, grieving widow preparing for a funeral. But there was no sorrow on her face. Her features were glowing with absolute radiant triumph. Cameron followed close behind her, wearing a completely ridiculous bespoke suit he had likely purchased on credit that very morning, assuming he was hours away from a massive payday. Russell, the corrupt attorney, entered last, carrying a thick leather briefcase that held the forged quitclaim deed and the fraudulent medical proxies. They walked into the pristine corporate space not with the caution of criminals, but with the supreme arrogance of lottery winners. They did not sit down at the massive conference table to review the legal documents. They treated the professional boardroom like a private VIP club. Cameron immediately walked over to the built-in wet bar in the corner of the room and pulled out a bottle of vintage champagne he had smuggled in his coat. He popped the cork, the sound echoing sharply through our hidden speakers. He poured 3 generous glasses, handing one to his mother and one to his lawyer. They gathered in the center of the room, raising their crystal glasses in a toast to a completely flawless victory. I sat in the dark watching the monitor as Diane took a slow sip of her champagne and let out a long, relieved laugh. She leaned against the edge of the table and told Cameron and Russell about the frantic phone call she had received from the county police dispatch just an hour ago. The authorities had officially deployed dive teams to search the frozen river near the abandoned train station. Diane actually mimicked her own fake crying for the men in the room, demonstrating how she had hysterically begged the police over the phone to find her poor, confused husband. Cameron burst into a loud, cruel laughter, calling me a pathetic old fool. He boasted about how incredibly easy it had been to empty my house while I was out wandering the freezing woods with no heavy coat and no wallet. He bragged to the lawyer about directing the moving crew to tear my custom architectural studio down to the floorboards, stripping away 40 years of my life work in a single afternoon. He took another long drink of champagne, celebrating the absolute erasure of my existence. Russell leaned against the glass table, checking his heavy gold watch. He told them to keep their voices down and save the real celebration until the Singaporean wire transfer actually cleared the holding account. But even the lawyer could not hide his own greedy anticipation. He congratulated Diane on the medical proxy, stating it was a stroke of absolute genius to use my routine doctor visit to build a fake early-onset dementia profile. Russell assured them that the corporate injunction blocking the pension fund was just a minor bureaucratic hurdle. He promised that once they had the millions from the cash house sale, he would use the forged medical documents to legally compel my former architectural firm to release the pension money. Russell looked at Diane and promised her that even if by some impossible miracle I had survived the freezing storm and stumbled into a police station, my medical records would instantly invalidate any accusation I made. He told them the house was gone, the pension was locked, and I was legally a ghost. They were all about to be incredibly wealthy and completely untouchable. Sitting in the dark observation room watching the woman I had loved and provided for drink champagne and laugh at the thought of my frozen corpse, I realized how thoroughly I had been deceived my entire marriage. She did not just want my money. She actively enjoyed my destruction. She reveled in the power of throwing me away. The anger inside me stopped burning and solidified into something heavy and permanent. I looked at Vincent sitting quietly beside me. He was listening to their laughter through the audio feed, his face a perfect mask of cold anticipation. He tapped his cane once against the carpeted floor, signaling that it was almost time. The digital clock on Evelyn's monitor ticked closer to 3:00. The representatives from the Singaporean consortium were supposed to arrive at any moment. Cameron checked his reflection in the boardroom window, adjusting his silk tie, completely unaware that the foreign buyers he was waiting for were actually the two terrified nephews we had broken yesterday. Russell opened his heavy briefcase and laid the fraudulent closing documents neatly on the glass table, smoothing out the forged signatures with the palm of his hand. They were completely relaxed, entirely confident that they had committed the perfect crime. They were ready to sign their names, collect their millions, and walk away into a perfect life. They had absolutely no idea that the room they were standing in was a carefully constructed cage. They had no idea that their lawyer was completely owned by the blind man sitting next door. And they had no idea that the husband they had murdered was standing just feet away, ready to turn the handle and walk into the room. The digital clock on the wall shifted to exactly 3:00. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom did not simply open, they were pushed apart with authoritative force. Two massive men wearing identical dark suits and earpieces stepped into the room, first perfectly synchronizing their movements to secure the perimeter. They were Vincent Elite Corporate Security Detail, and their sudden presence instantly sucked the celebratory oxygen out of the room. Cameron stopped laughing. He lowered his champagne glass, his brow furrowing in confusion. He expected to see a team of foreign investors bowing politely, not a paramilitary strike force taking physical control of the exits. Russell, the lawyer, stood up from the glass table, attempting to project a facade of legal authority, but his hands were already trembling. Following the security detail, Vincent walked slowly into the harsh overhead lighting. He moved with the terrifying grace of a predator who owned the very ground he walked on. The rhythmic tapping of his silver cane against the hardwood floor sounded like a countdown clock. Diane stared at the blind billionaire, her smile completely vanishing. She did not recognize him, but the sheer magnitude of power radiating from his posture made her instinctively take a step backward. She looked past Vincent, waiting for the anonymous Singaporean buyer to reveal himself. Then I stepped across the threshold. I did not look like the confused, shivering old man she had abandoned at the freezing train station. I was wearing a $5,000 bespoke charcoal suit, tailored perfectly to my frame. My posture was completely straight, my shoulders squared, and my eyes locked directly onto the woman who had tried to erase my existence. The silence that fell over the boardroom was absolute and deafening. It was the sound of a perfectly constructed reality completely shattering into a million jagged pieces. Cameron let out a sound that was half gasp and half choke. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his numb fingers and shattered against the floor, spilling expensive alcohol across the polished wood. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of the leather sofa. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost materialize in broad daylight. Russell, the corrupt lawyer, stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He looked down at the forged medical proxies resting on the table, and then looked back at my perfectly composed face, realizing in a single devastating second that he had committed federal fraud to murder a man who was very much alive. But Diane's reaction was the most profound. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen gray. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with an unspeakable terror. She had built her entire brilliant future on the absolute certainty that I was freezing to death in the upstate woods. She had shed fake tears for the police dispatch, and she had laughed about my demise just moments ago. Now the victim she had so easily discarded was standing in front of her, blocking the only exit to the room. I did not scream. I did not rage. I walked slowly toward the glass conference table, my dress shoes crunching over the broken glass of Cameron's shattered champagne flute. I looked at the three of them, their faces frozen in absolute panic. I told them they looked surprised. I kept my voice incredibly calm, smooth, and entirely devoid of emotion. I told Diane I was terribly sorry to interrupt their little celebration, but I heard they were selling my house at a severe discount, and I simply could not resist a good real estate bargain. Diane tried to speak. She tried to formulate a sentence, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She let out a pathetic whimpering sound, pressing herself against the far wall of the boardroom. Cameron finally found his voice, though it was trembling violently. He pointed a shaking finger at me and stammered that this was impossible. He said the police were dragging the rivers for my body. He said I was supposed to be suffering from severe dementia. I looked at Cameron with absolute disgust. I told him he should never rely on the medical diagnosis of a corrupt doctor when millions of dollars are on the line. I turned my attention to Russell. The lawyer was sweating profusely, pulling nervously at the collar of his expensive shirt. I told Russell that forging a quitclaim deed was a risky career move, but forging it to steal from a man who is standing right in front of him was professional suicide. Vincent stepped forward, standing firmly at my right side. I introduced him to the room. I told Diane and Cameron that they had spent the last 2 days trying to outsmart local banks and county clerks. I told them they thought they were playing a brilliant game of financial chess. I gestured to Vincent and told them this was the man who actually owned the board. I explained that the Singaporean investment consortium they were so desperate to sell my house to did not exist. I told them there was no foreign money waiting in a holding account. The entire acquisition offer, the frantic deadline, the anonymous buyer, it was all a perfectly engineered illusion designed to trap them in this exact room. Diane's legs finally gave out. She collapsed into one of the heavy leather boardroom chairs, gripping the armrests so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She looked at the forged legal documents sitting on the glass table, and then looked up at me, her eyes begging for a mercy she did not deserve. She realized they had not just failed to steal my money. They had willingly delivered themselves, along with all the physical evidence of their crimes, directly into my hands. They had walked entirely voluntarily into a room filled with corporate security guards, carrying the exact documents needed to send them all to federal prison. The trap had closed with a deafening snap, and they were entirely, completely caught. I stood at the head of the table, looking down at the empire of lies they had built. It was time to show them exactly how thoroughly they had been destroyed. Diane stared at me for a long, agonizing moment before her survival instinct finally overrode her shock. She knew the walls were closing in, but she refused to surrender. Instead of confessing, she doubled down on the exact lie that had started this entire nightmare. She threw herself back into the role of the terrified, grieving wife. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest and began to scream. Her voice echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom, shrill and desperate. She yelled to the security guards that I was completely insane. She claimed I was a severely sick man who had wandered away from home and was suffering from violent delusions. She turned to Russell and demanded that he call the police immediately. She screamed that I needed to be physically restrained for my own safety. She played the part perfectly, letting tears stream down her face, begging the men in the room to protect her from her delusional husband. Cameron, seeing his mother pivot, immediately jumped onto the life raft. He puffed out his chest and took a step toward me, trying to project false bravery. He yelled that I had no legal right to be in this building and that my brain was completely rotting away. He commanded Vincent to back away, claiming I was a dangerous liability who belonged in a locked, padded room. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. I simply stood at the head of the conference table and let them scream. I watched the frantic performance with absolute cold detachment. I let them expend all their frantic energy, filling the room with their pathetic, desperate lies. When Diane finally paused to catch her breath, wiping the fake tears from her cheeks, the silence in the boardroom returned, heavy and suffocating. I slowly reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out a perfectly crisp, folded stack of thick medical parchment. I placed the documents onto the glass table right next to the fraudulent medical proxy they had paid their corrupt doctor to sign. I smoothed the paper flat with the palm of my hand. I looked directly into Diane's eyes and told her that her performance was incredibly moving, but entirely useless. I explained to the room that while she was busy trying to sell my home to a phantom buyer yesterday afternoon, I was busy securing my own defense. I told her I did not go to a local country club doctor looking for a quick favor. Vincent had arranged for me to spend the entire morning at the most prestigious private neurological institute in Manhattan. I was subjected to a grueling, comprehensive 4-hour cognitive evaluation. I was examined not by one easily bribed physician, but by a panel of 3 elite independent neurologists. I tapped my finger against the heavy embossed seal at the top of the page. I read the summary of the findings aloud, my voice steady and completely unyielding. The board of neurologists concluded that I possessed absolutely perfect cognitive function. They noted that my memory recall was flawless, my spatial awareness was acute, and my psychological state was entirely stable. The document clearly stated that there was absolutely zero evidence of dementia or any other degenerative mental condition. I slid the thick medical file across the smooth glass surface until it rested directly in front of Diane. I told her to look at the signatures. I told her to look at the timestamps proving the evaluation was conducted less than 24 hours ago. I explained that these documents legally invalidated the cheap, fraudulent proxy she was clinging to. The medical authority of the Manhattan Institute completely annihilated the credibility of her small-town country club doctor. Diane stared down at the documents as if they were poisonous. Her mouth hung open, but the screaming had completely stopped. The fake tears dried on her face, replaced by a look of sheer, genuine horror. The single crutch she had relied upon to steal my life had just been kicked out from under her. She realized the terrible gravity of what those new papers meant. I turned my gaze toward Russell. The corrupt attorney was staring at the embossed seal on my medical evaluation, as if he were staring at his own death warrant. He understood the legal mechanics of this situation better than anyone else in the room. He knew that the moment a superior medical board contradicted his forged proxy, his entire legal shield completely evaporated. I told Russell that he had built his entire career on exploiting the weak, but he had fundamentally miscalculated my strength. I explained that the elite neurologists who signed my evaluation were completely untouchable, and their testimony in a federal courtroom would result in his immediate disbarment. Russell began to hyperventilate, tugging frantically at his silk tie. He took a physical step away from Diane, treating her like an absolute contagion. Cameron watched his legal defender retreat, and the panic completely consumed him. He began to babble incoherently, offering pathetic excuses. He claimed he was just following his mother's instructions. He actually tried to throw the woman who had orchestrated this entire theft directly under the bus to save his own skin. He pointed at Diane and told me that the offshore loan and the forged deed were entirely her idea. The absolute cowardice of his betrayal echoed through the quiet boardroom. Diane slowly turned her head and looked at her son, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and utter disgust. The unbreakable bond of their shared greed had instantly disintegrated the moment they faced actual consequences. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of the table. I told Diane she was more than welcome to call the police. In fact, I encouraged her to dial the number right now, but I made sure she understood exactly what would happen when the officers walked through those mahogany doors. I told her they would not look at me and see a confused, wandering patient. They would look at the elite medical evaluations and see a perfectly sane, wealthy man standing next to his billionaire business partner. Then I told her exactly what the police would see when they looked at her. They would see a woman who filed a false missing persons report, triggering a massive waste of county resources. They would see a woman who committed medical fraud to strip a sane man of his civil rights. They would look at the forged quitclaim deed and the fraudulent pension requests resting on the table, and they would immediately arrest her for attempted grand larceny and federal wire fraud. I promised her that if the police arrived, I would not be the one leaving the building in an ambulance. She and her son would be leaving in handcuffs. The absolute reality of her situation finally crushed the last remaining ounce of her defiance. Diane slumped down in her chair, completely paralyzed. Cameron retreated, backing away until his shoulders hit the glass wall of the boardroom, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. They were entirely stripped of their weapons. They could not use the law, they could not use my health, and they could not use my money. The trap had not just sprung, it had completely shattered their entire foundation, leaving them completely defenseless in the center of the room. Russell did not care about Diane or her son. He was a creature driven entirely by self-preservation, and right now, his survival instincts were screaming at him to flee. He looked at the flawless medical evaluation sitting on the glass table and realized his forged documents were completely legally radioactive. He practically lunged forward, grabbing the edge of his thick leather briefcase. He began to hastily shove his folders and pens inside, snapping the brass locks shut with shaking hands. He announced to the room that this meeting was officially terminated. He stammered that he was acting as legal counsel, and he was invoking attorney-client privilege to immediately withdraw his representation. He did not even look at Diane. He turned his back on her entirely, grabbing his coat and marching directly toward the heavy mahogany doors. He thought he could just walk away. He thought he could wash his hands of the conspiracy step onto an elevator and return to his flashy leased office to figure out how to cover his tracks. He did not understand that the doors were guarded by men who did not take orders from panicked lawyers. The two massive security guards stepped together seamlessly, forming an impenetrable wall of solid dark suits and solid muscle. Russell stopped dead in his tracks, his chest heaving, his face slick with cold sweat. He turned back toward the table, his voice cracking as he threatened to sue us all for false imprisonment. He pointed his finger at Vincent, claiming that a billionaire could not hold an officer of the court hostage. Vincent let out a low, dark chuckle that echoed chillingly through the silent boardroom. He leaned forward, resting his hands heavily on the silver handle of his cane. He told Russell that he was not being held hostage. He was simply attending a mandatory meeting with his primary corporate creditor. Russell blinked in confusion, his aggressive posture entirely faltering. He looked from Vincent to me, completely failing to understand the connection. I walked over to the glass table and picked up a single sheet of paper that Evelyn had prepared for me earlier that morning. It was not a medical document. It was a commercial financial summary. I held it up so Russell could see the official bank letterhead. I told him that I knew all about his massive class action losses. I knew about the exorbitant operating costs of his high-rent office. And most importantly, I knew about the $2 million balloon payment he owed to a private high-risk lending institution. The blood drained completely from Russell's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His hands began to shake so violently he almost dropped his leather briefcase. He asked me how I knew about his private commercial loans. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone absolutely smooth and entirely lethal. I told him I did not just know about the loan. I owned it. I explained that at 2:00 this morning while he was sleeping, soundly dreaming about the millions he was going to make from selling my stolen house, Vincent, private equity firm, executed a hostile overnight buyout of his exact debt portfolio. I told him we paid entirely in liquid cash and the federal wire transfers had already cleared international channels. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that his failing law firm, his expensive leased office, and his entire professional existence were now the exclusive property of the blind billionaire sitting quietly at the table. Russell staggered backward, his knees buckling slightly under the weight of the revelation. He hit the edge of a leather chair and collapsed into it, entirely defeated. The sheer velocity of the financial violence had completely broken his spirit. He had walked into this building thinking he was a brilliant legal predator, and he had just discovered he was nothing but a pawn on a board we entirely controlled. I walked slowly toward him, closing the distance until I was standing directly over his chair. I laid out the absolute reality of his situation. I told him that as his supreme creditor, I had the legal right to call his $2 million note due by the end of the business day. When he failed to pay, I would foreclose on his firm, seize his personal assets, and submit his financial records to the State Bar Association, triggering an immediate public disbarment hearing. But that was only the financial ruin. I reminded him that he was currently sitting in a room holding forged real estate deeds and fraudulent medical proxies designed to steal millions of dollars from a living, breathing man. If he walked out of this room with those documents, he was an active participant in a federal criminal conspiracy. He would lose his license, his money, and his freedom before the sun went down. I offered him one single narrow path to survival. I told him the crime-fraud exception completely invalidated his attorney-client privilege. He had absolutely no legal obligation to protect Diane and Cameron because they had used his services to commit a felony. I pointed to his leather briefcase resting on his lap. I told him that if he opened that case right now and handed me every single piece of physical evidence proving their conspiracy, I would allow his law firm to survive. I would restructure his massive debt into a manageable payment plan, and I would not name him in the federal wire fraud indictments I was about to file against my wife. The choice was not even a calculation. It was absolute, pure self-interest. Russell did not even look at Diane to apologize. He completely severed his loyalty to her in a fraction of a second. He frantically popped the brass locks on his briefcase, his hands moving with desperate, uncoordinated speed. He pulled out thick manila folders and slammed them onto the glass table, sliding them directly toward me. He handed me the original quitclaim deed bearing my forged signature. He handed me the notarized affidavits from Cameron corrupt foreman. He handed me the digital routing numbers for the offshore Cayman Islands shadow bank. And finally, he handed me a series of printed emails between himself and Diane. I glanced down at the top email. It clearly detailed her exact timeline to liquidate my pension before the county police found my frozen body in the upstate woods. The emails proved premeditation, malice, and a complete disregard for my human life. He gave me the absolute undeniable blueprint of their entire criminal enterprise handed over on a silver platter. Diane watched her lawyer completely betray her. She let out a hollow, devastated sob, pressing her hands over her face. She had believed she was surrounding herself with loyal, brilliant accomplices. She had no idea she had simply hired bottom-feeding mercenaries who would instantly sell her out to save their own skin. Cameron stood frozen against the glass wall, watching the mountain of incriminating evidence pile up on the table. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the room looking for an escape that simply did not exist. I picked up the stack of folders, feeling the heavy weight of their absolute destruction in my hands. I looked at Russell and told him he had made a very wise corporate decision. I told him he was free to leave the boardroom and instructed him to expect a call from my accountants in the morning. The security guards stepped aside, allowing the terrified lawyer to practically run out of the room. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind him, leaving Diane and Cameron entirely alone with me and the mountain of evidence that was about to end their lives. The legal shield was gone. The financial shield was gone. It was time for the final execution. Diane sat completely paralyzed in the heavy leather chair. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. I did not give her time to invent a new lie. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my mobile phone. I dialed the emergency dispatch number. I put the phone on speaker and set it down on the glass conference table right next to the forged real estate documents. The dispatcher answered, asking for the exact nature of my emergency. I spoke clearly and deliberately. I stated my name was George Weaver. I told the dispatcher that I was currently the subject of an active missing persons investigation in the upstate county. I explained that I was not missing and I was not suffering from any form of dementia. I told the dispatcher that my wife and her adult son had filed a false police report to cover up an active multi-million-dollar corporate fraud and an attempted grand larceny. I gave them the exact floor and suite number of the Manhattan high-rise and requested immediate police presence. I ended the call. The click of the phone disconnecting sounded like a heavy steel door slamming shut. Diane let out a sound like a wounded animal. She practically threw herself out of the leather chair and fell to her knees beside the glass table. She begged me to call them back. She pleaded with me to tell the dispatch it was a terrible misunderstanding. She looked up at me with mascara running down her face, attempting to summon the warmth of our marriage. She wept and told me she was so incredibly sorry. She claimed the pressure of my impending retirement and our financial future had made her completely panic. She swore she never truly meant to hurt me and that her son had pressured her into the real estate scheme. She offered to rip up the forged documents right now. She promised we could go back to our beautiful home and forget this ever happened. It was the most pathetic display of emotional manipulation I had ever witnessed. I looked down at the woman I had spent the last decade of my life protecting and providing for. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I pulled my coat away from her grasping hands. I told her not to insult my intelligence by pretending she cared about our marriage or my well-being. I reminded her of the exact temperature of the freezing rain at the train station. I reminded her of the sickening sound her tires made when she deliberately sped away, leaving me to freeze to death on an empty platform. I told her that she did not regret betraying me. She only regretted that I had survived long enough to walk into this room and stop her. I told her the woman I married died the moment she left me in the dark. The person kneeling on the floor in front of me now was just a common thief waiting to be processed into the federal prison system. The reality of the impending police arrival finally shattered the last remnants of Cameron's false bravado. He looked at his mother sobbing on the floor and realized she possessed absolutely no power to save him. He looked at the mountain of forged documents on the table that guaranteed his long-term incarceration. His eyes darted wildly around the boardroom, searching for an exit. The primitive instinct of a cornered coward took over completely. He decided he was not going to spend the best years of his life in a federal penitentiary. He let out a desperate, frantic yell and lunged toward the heavy mahogany doors. He moved with the reckless speed of pure adrenaline, hoping to slip past the blockade and disappear into the crowded Manhattan streets. He did not even make it 3 steps. The 2 massive men from Vincent Elite Corporate Security Detail moved with terrifying professional efficiency. They did not draw weapons or shout loud commands. They simply stepped directly into his path and intercepted his flight like a concrete wall. One guard grabbed Cameron by the lapels of his expensive bespoke suit jacket, spinning him around with bone-jarring force. The other guard swept Cameron's legs entirely out from under him. Cameron slammed hard onto the polished hardwood floor, his breath leaving his lungs in a loud rush. The guards pinned his arms firmly behind his back, holding him completely immobilized against the ground. Cameron thrashed and screamed, threatening to sue them for assault. But the guards remained completely silent and entirely unmovable. He was trapped like a frantic insect pinned under a heavy stone, entirely stripped of his arrogant posture. We waited in absolute silence for 10 agonizing minutes. The only sounds in this boardroom were Cameron muffled, pathetic curses from the floor, and Diane quiet, desperate sobbing from the corner. Then the heavy doors were pushed open again. 4 uniformed New York police officers entered the room, followed closely by 2 plainclothes detectives. They stepped into the high-rise boardroom expecting to find a standard corporate dispute or a trespassing issue. Instead, they found a weeping woman in a designer dress, a man pinned to the floor by private security, and a blind billionaire standing silently next to me. The lead detective stepped forward, demanding to know who placed the emergency call and what exactly was going on. I stepped out from behind the conference table, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I introduced myself clearly as George Weaver. The detective froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. He immediately recognized my name from the statewide missing persons alert. He looked at me with deep, profound confusion, noting my expensive suit, my calm demeanor, and my perfect composure. He told me the upstate county authorities were currently dredging a frozen river looking for my drowned body. He asked me if I knew my wife had reported me as a severely disoriented dementia patient who was completely incapable of caring for himself. I walked slowly over to the glass table. I told the detective that my wife had reported me missing solely so she could execute the documents sitting right in front of him. I picked up the thick manila folders the corrupt lawyer had abandoned. I handed the lead detective the original quitclaim deed bearing my clearly forged signature. I handed him the fraudulent medical proxy signed by the corrupt country club doctor. I handed him the printed emails detailing their explicit calculated plan to liquidate my pension funds and funnel the cash into offshore accounts before my body was ever discovered. And finally, I handed him the pristine neurological evaluation I had completed that very morning, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was in perfect cognitive health. The lead detective slowly flipped through the mountain of incontrovertible physical evidence. He read the printed emails, absorbing the absolute malice in Diane's words. He looked at the forged real estate deeds. He cross-referenced the dates on the fake medical proxy with the timestamps on the authentic neurological evaluation. The confusion on his face completely vanished, replaced by the hardened expression of a seasoned investigator who had just been handed a perfectly wrapped federal crime. He looked up from the documents and turned his cold gaze toward Diane. The transition in the room was instantaneous and absolute. She was no longer treated as a grieving widow or a concerned wealthy family member. She was instantly reclassified as a highly dangerous criminal suspect. The detective gestured sharply to his uniformed officers. He instructed them to place Diane and Cameron under immediate arrest for grand larceny, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and filing a false police report. 2 officers approached the corner where Diane sat paralyzed. They ordered her to stand up and place her hands behind her back. She did not resist. Her spirit was entirely broken. She stood up, her body shaking uncontrollably as the officers turned her around. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping closed around her wrists echoed loudly through the silent boardroom. It was the absolute final sound of her destruction. Her elegant black designer dress and her expensive jewelry suddenly looked entirely ridiculous against the stark, brutal reality of the metal restraints binding her hands. Another officer pulled Cameron up from the hardwood floor, twisting his arms behind his back and snapping handcuffs onto his wrists, while he continued to sob and beg for a lawyer. I stood next to Vincent, watching the officers read them their Miranda rights. The words echoed off the glass walls, cementing their absolute ruin. Diane looked over her shoulder at me one last time as the police began to lead her toward the door. Her eyes were completely hollow, entirely devoid of the arrogant entitlement that had defined her entire life. She walked out of the luxury boardroom in handcuffs, completely stripped of her wealth, her dignity, and her freedom. I had not just survived the freezing storm. I had brought the storm back with me and completely washed them away. The elevator ride down from the 50th floor was the quietest and most peaceful moment of my entire adult life. I did not follow the police to the precinct. I had absolutely no desire to watch my wife get fingerprinted or stand behind a two-way mirror while detectives interrogated her son. I had delivered the physical evidence and the perpetrators perfectly wrapped to the authorities. My personal involvement in their destruction was officially complete. Now it was time to let the cold, merciless machinery of the federal justice system do what it does best. It was time for the professional execution of their entire existence. The aftermath was not a slow, burning legal drama. It was a swift and absolute financial demolition. Because Cameron had attempted to secure an offshore loan through a Cayman Islands shadow bank, he had crossed the threshold from a local domestic dispute into international corporate fraud. The local county police immediately handed the entire investigation over to the federal authorities. By Monday morning, federal agents had completely taken over the case. Diane and Cameron were not sitting in a local jail cell waiting for a sympathetic judge. They were transferred to a federal holding facility. Their arraignment was a masterpiece of legal humiliation. Vincent dispatched one of his junior attorneys to simply sit in the gallery and observe the proceedings, ensuring we had a front-row seat to their ruin. The attorney reported back to us that afternoon. Diane had shuffled into the courtroom wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, her hair completely unkempt, her hands shackled to a waist chain. She looked entirely broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant socialite who had sipped champagne just days prior. Cameron looked even worse. He was pale, trembling, and completely unable to look the federal magistrate in the eye. The assistant United States attorney did not show them a single ounce of mercy. He laid out the mountain of incontrovertible evidence I had provided. He presented the forged quitclaim deed, the fraudulent medical proxies, the printed emails detailing their premeditated timeline, and the digital banking logs showing their attempt to move millions of dollars out of the country. He argued that because they had actively attempted to utilize offshore banking channels, they were severe flight risks. The magistrate agreed completely. Bail was categorically denied. They were remanded back into federal custody to await trial. They would not be sleeping in luxury apartments or my sprawling estate. They would be sleeping on thin mattresses in a concrete cell. But the physical incarceration was only the first layer of their punishment. The federal government possesses a terrifying tool called civil asset forfeiture, and they deployed it against Cameron with breathtaking speed. Cameron had believed he was a criminal mastermind when he used his commercial contracting business as a shell company to launder the stolen funds. He thought the corporate veil would protect him. Instead, it gave the federal agents the exact legal justification they needed to seize absolutely everything he had ever built. Within 48 hours of the boardroom arrest, federal agents raided Cameron Contracting headquarters. They did not just confiscate his computers and his filing cabinets. They seized the entire company because the business infrastructure was actively used in the commissions of a federal wire fraud conspiracy. Every single asset tied to that company was instantly frozen and seized by the government. They impounded his fleet of commercial trucks. They seized his expensive, heavy machinery. They froze his corporate bank accounts and his personal payroll. They completely dismantled his livelihood in a single morning. The profound irony of the situation brought a cold smile to my face. A decade ago, I had written the $200,000 check that saved his failing business. I had given him the foundation for his entire adult life. Now, because he tried to use that exact same business to steal my home, the government was ripping it all away. He was left with absolutely zero liquid capital. He could not even afford to hire a private criminal defense attorney. He was forced to accept a completely overworked public defender who immediately advised him that his only option was to plead guilty and hope for a reduced sentence. His loyal crew completely abandoned him. Marcus, the foreman, who had illegally notarized the forged real estate documents, was arrested the very next day. Marcus was a man driven entirely by self-interest, and the moment the federal agents threatened him with 20 years in prison, he folded completely. He immediately turned state's evidence. He signed a comprehensive confession detailing exactly how Cameron had ordered him to forge the notary stamps and how Diane had promised them all a massive payout from the estate sale. Marcus' testimony was the final nail in the coffin, completely eliminating any chance they had of fighting the charges in front of a jury. Diane suffered a destruction that was both financial and profoundly social. She had spent our entire marriage meticulously cultivating an image of wealth, sophistication, and moral superiority among her affluent friends. She thrived on country club gossip and charity gala appearances. The moment the federal indictments were unsealed, her carefully constructed social empire completely evaporated. The local news networks obtained the police reports and broadcasted the entire horrific story. They detailed how a wealthy wife had abandoned her elderly husband at a freezing train station and tried to have him declared legally insane to steal his pension. Her country club membership was immediately and permanently revoked. Her friends, the women she had gossiped with over expensive lunches, entirely cut all contact with her. Nobody answered her desperate phone calls from the federal detention center. She was completely socially radioactive. Furthermore, because she was a co-conspirator in the wire fraud, the federal agents completely froze all of her personal bank accounts, including the joint checking account she had drained the morning she abandoned me. She was left entirely destitute. She had traded a life of comfort and security for a desperate gamble, and she had lost absolutely everything. Even the corrupt professionals she had relied upon were systematically destroyed. Dr. Pierce, the physician who had signed the fraudulent medical proxy, completely underestimating the consequences of his greed, was arrested at his luxury private clinic. The state medical board instantly suspended his license pending a full criminal investigation. Federal agents seized his patient records, discovering a long history of falsifying medical documents for wealthy clients. His lucrative career was completely annihilated, and he was facing his own separate federal indictment for medical fraud and conspiracy. Every single person who had participated in the attempt to erase my existence was methodically hunted down and ruined by the legal system. I did not attend any of their subsequent court hearings. I had absolutely no desire to hear their pathetic apologies or watch them cry as the judge handed down their sentences. I simply read the final legal briefings provided by Vincent attorneys. Diane and Cameron both accepted plea deals, recognizing that a public trial would only result in maximum sentences. They both pled guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud conspiracy and filing false police reports. They were sentenced to substantial terms in federal prison with mandatory restitution orders that would garnish any wages they ever earned for the rest of their natural lives. They would never own property again. They would never hold positions of trust again. They were permanently branded as federal felons. Their execution was completely bloodless, but it was absolute. They had tried to push me into a dark, freezing grave, and instead they had dug a permanent cell for themselves. The chaos they had unleashed had been entirely contained and completely reflected back onto them. The federal justice system had swept them away, leaving the board entirely clean. The chapter of my life involving my treacherous wife and her greedy son was officially, permanently closed. I was finally completely free to begin rebuilding my life on my own terms, without looking over my shoulder. The federal authorities unsealed my property the following week, returning the legal possession of the estate entirely to me. I drove back to the sprawling, mid-century modern home I had built with my own two hands over 4 decades of meticulous architectural planning. I parked my newly leased luxury car in the long circular driveway and walked through the heavy front door. The house was completely empty. The commercial moving crew hired by Cameron had stripped it down to the bare floorboards before the federal agents raided his company. There was absolutely no furniture left. There were no paintings hanging on the walls. The custom oak library I had designed and constructed was entirely vacant and echoing. A normal man might have dropped to his knees and wept bitterly at the sight of his erased history and stolen memories. I simply stood in the center of the expansive living room and listened to the hollow silence. I did not feel a single trace of sorrow or longing. I realized with absolute clarity that the house was just wood and glass and stone. The memories attached to it had been permanently poisoned by the woman who had callously tried to steal it. I did not want to live in a mausoleum of my own past mistakes. I walked out and locked the front door for the very last time. I handed the keys directly to an elite luxury real estate broker. I instructed him to list the property on the open public market and accept the highest all-cash offer with 0 contingencies. The beautiful estate sold in less than 14 days to a wealthy overseas technology executive. The millions of dollars from the rapid sale were wired directly into a newly established, secure, blind trust. I completely liquidated my past. I severed every single physical and emotional tie to the suburban life I had lived with Diane. I took the massive influx of cash and moved permanently into the heart of Manhattan, purchasing a stark modern penthouse just 3 short blocks away from the corporate headquarters of Vincent. For the first entire month, I focused exclusively on securing my newly liberated assets and familiarizing myself with the intricate global markets. But absolute peace can quickly become its own kind of suffocating prison. I had spent 40 long years working as an architectural consultant, building massive commercial structures that were designed to last for lifetimes. I was not a man who could simply sit on a high-rise balcony, sipping expensive wine and watch the city move without actively participating in its complex machinery. One cold, rainy Tuesday morning, I took the private secure elevator up to the top-floor penthouse where Vincent lived. He was sitting at his massive marble dining table, silently listening to an encrypted financial briefing read aloud by his executive assistant. I poured myself a hot cup of black coffee and sat directly across from him. I told him that surviving my treacherous wife was the most exhilarating and simultaneously terrifying experience of my entire life, but I was absolutely not ready to retire into quiet obscurity. I pointed out a terrifying systemic reality that had been keeping me awake at night. My wife almost succeeded in her sinister plot, because the legal system is inherently designed to favor the young and the ruthless predators. For every elderly man who gets incredibly lucky and meets a powerful blind billionaire at a freezing upstate train station, there are 10,000 vulnerable individuals who simply freeze to death in the dark. There are thousands of helpless parents and grandparents currently locked inside sterile psychiatric wards, or quietly stripped of their entire life savings by entitled greedy children armed with forged legal documents. I told Vincent that the corporate legal strike team we used to completely dismantle my family was the single most effective weapon I had ever witnessed in my life. I proposed we build an entirely new kind of architecture together. I wanted to build an impenetrable fortress of legal and financial protection. I wanted to start a philanthropic venture, but I made it very clear I did not want to run a traditional soft charity. Traditional charities beg for public donations and write polite pleading letters to politicians. I wanted to build an aggressive, predatory defense firm entirely dedicated to hunting down abusive relatives and financially ruining them without a shred of mercy. Vincent smiled that slow, chilling, familiar smile. He tapped his heavy silver cane against the polished hardwood floor and completely agreed with my proposition. We immediately pooled our vast liquid resources and launched a completely new subsidiary division of his massive private equity firm. We named it the Apex Vanguard Group. I took the official role of senior managing director overseeing all daily operations. We hired Evelyn permanently away from her freelance contracts and installed her as our chief intelligence officer. We brought the entire team of ruthless corporate litigators directly into our private, secure offices. We built an absolute living nightmare for predatory heirs. The entire operation was mechanically flawless and terrifyingly efficient. We established secure, confidential hotlines inside high-end nursing homes and luxury retirement communities and local private banking branches. When a concerned bank teller noticed a suspicious sudden transfer from an elderly client account, they did not bother calling the local police because the police always require absolute impossible proof. They called our secure hotline instead. Evelyn would immediately deploy her advanced digital extraction tools to audit the entire financial architecture of the suspect family. If we found a greedy son secretly forging a property deed, or a desperate daughter falsifying a medical proxy to steal a pension, we did not send them a polite warning letter or threaten a lawsuit. We executed the exact same devastating strategy we used to destroy my wife. We weaponized our massive billion-dollar capital pool to quietly buy their personal commercial debts. We filed catastrophic corporate injunctions against their private shell companies. We trapped them in inescapable legal snares that completely froze their stolen assets overnight. We did not just passively rescue the elderly victims from their abusers. We ensured the perpetrators were left entirely bankrupt, entirely destitute, and facing severe federal criminal indictments before they even realized they were under any sort of investigation. Within 6 short months, our firm had completely dismantled 14 separate domestic fraud syndicates across the eastern seaboard. I remember a specific case involving a wealthy widow in Connecticut. Her 2 adult nephews had conspired with a corrupt local probate judge to declare her mentally unfit simply because she wanted to donate her massive estate to a wildlife sanctuary. They had her locked inside a state medical facility and were actively auctioning off her priceless family heirlooms. We did not waste precious time filing standard appeals in the slow local courts. Vincent bought the commercial mortgage on the private vacation home of the corrupt judge, and our lawyers uncovered massive hidden irregularities in the offshore tax returns of the nephews. In less than a single week, the terrified judge suddenly reversed his own ruling, releasing the widow completely and retiring from the judicial bench in absolute public disgrace. The nephews were audited by the federal government and lost absolutely everything they owned. We returned the widow safely to her home and placed her entire estate in an impenetrable blind trust. Every single victory we achieved felt like a profound personal vindication. Every time we crushed a greedy relative, I felt a deep sense of absolute closure. I realized that my own horrific suffering at that desolate train station was not a meaningless tragedy at all. It was a required, harsh education. I had to experience the absolute depths of human betrayal so I could fully understand exactly how the predators operate in the dark. You cannot hunt dangerous wolves if you do not understand how they circle their helpless prey. My wife thought she was burying a weak old man, but she inadvertently forged a weapon that was now systematically destroying people exactly like her. The pain of my past was entirely repurposed into a perfectly calibrated machine of absolute retribution and salvation. It is now 2 full years since the night of the freezing storm. The weather outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive office is cold and incredibly unforgiving. The bitter November wind is howling through the concrete canyons of the city, rattling the thick, soundproof glass. I sit in a heavy leather chair across from the desk of my billionaire partner, wearing a custom-tailored dark suit. A massive, encrypted digital monitor dominates the center of the spacious room, displaying the complex financial portfolio of a prominent real estate developer in Boston. Evelyn just delivered the intelligence dossier 30 minutes ago. The developer is secretly trying to force his elderly mother out of her company shares using a fabricated psychological evaluation. He thinks he is a brilliant corporate tactician playing a completely flawless game. He has absolutely no idea that a blind billionaire and a supposed dead man are currently mapping out the exact coordinates of his impending financial execution. Vincent leans back in his chair, his sightless eyes facing the window. He asks me if the trap is fully set. I look at the glowing digital numbers on the screen, verifying that our offshore holding company just successfully purchased the primary massive loan on the most expensive commercial project the developer currently owns. We now own his entire debt. We control his absolute survival. I close the thick leather folder resting on my lap. I tell Vincent the snare is perfectly primed, and the arrogant target is completely isolated. I do not think about my past anymore. I do not wonder what my ex-wife is doing in her small federal prison cell. I do not care if her son is scrubbing floors to pay off his massive restitution debts. They are entirely insignificant ghosts in a world I have completely conquered. I pick up my heavy crystal glass of aged scotch and take a slow, deliberate sip. The warmth travels down my throat, a stark, beautiful contrast to the freezing rain that almost ended my life. I survived the absolute coldest night of my existence. But more importantly, I learned the ultimate truth about power and survival. I learned how to freeze out those who betrayed me, and I learned exactly how to build an untouchable empire from the ice. The greatest lesson I extracted from the freezing rain is that loyalty can never be assumed simply because of shared history or a wedding ring. We are often taught to forgive the cruelties of our family, under the naive belief that blood and vows are sacred. But predators do not respect vows. They only respect power and consequences. True strength is not found in endlessly suffering in silence or waiting for an apology that will never arrive. True strength is the cold, terrifying willingness to let the people who tried to destroy you face the absolute ruin of their own creation. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family member and rebuild your empire from the ashes, share your survival story in the comments below and subscribe to our channel.